A man walks through the streets of Moscow on an October morning in 1962. His steps are measured, deliberate. A gray suit, a worn briefcase, the kind of figure that disappears into the cityscape. To any observer, he is simply another functionary navigating the bureaucratic corridors of Soviet power. But beneath this surface, a different reality unfolds, invisible to all except those trained to see. The man doesn't notice the surveillance team maintaining a discreet perimeter around him. He doesn't see the parked vehicles with their engines warm, ready. He doesn't register the coded radio transmissions crackling through the air, confirming his position, his trajectory, his inevitable destination. The machinery of state security has been watching him for weeks, perhaps months. Each step he takes has been cataloged, analyzed, transformed into evidence. On the 22nd of October, at precisely 1400 hours, the trap closes. Multiple vehicles converge. Plainclothes officers emerge with practiced efficiency. There is no chase, no dramatic confrontation. The arrest happens in seconds, clinical and absolute. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky, colonel of the GRU, hero of the Soviet military intelligence apparatus, disappears from the street as if he never existed. This was not a random apprehension. This was the culmination of the most dangerous espionage operation of the Cold War. This was the moment when the invisible machinery of counterintelligence completed its work, when months of tradecraft, surveillance, and strategic patience converged on a single target. This was the capture of the man whose intelligence had already altered the course of history. This was the end of codename Hero, codename Yoga, the man who betrayed the Soviet Union to save the world. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky was born on April the 23rd, 1919, in the turbulent closing chapters of the Russian Civil War. Before his first birthday, his father was killed, fighting as an officer in the White Army, the anti-Bolshevik forces destined to lose. This origin would become Penkovsky's original sin, a biographical stain that would shadow every achievement, every promotion, every attempt to rise within the Soviet system. In Stalin's USSR, bloodline was destiny. The son of a White Army officer was forever suspect. Yet Penkovsky possessed something that could partially overcome this liability: exceptional competence. Raised in the North Caucasus, he excelled in the rigid Soviet educational system. He entered the Kiev Artillery Academy and emerged with a diploma in military engineering and the rank of lieutenant by 1939. When war came, first against Finland in the Winter War, then the catastrophic Nazi invasion of 1941, Penkovsky proved himself under fire. He rose through the ranks, reaching lieutenant colonel by war's end, accumulating decorations and, crucially, the patronage of powerful men. Chief among these patrons was Colonel General Sergei Vorontsov, commander of artillery on the First Ukrainian Front. Vorontsov recognized Penkovsky's capabilities and made him his liaison officer after both men were wounded in 1944. This connection would define Penkovsky's career. He leveraged it again in 1945 when he married the teenage daughter of Lieutenant General Dmitry Gapanovich, acquiring a second high-ranking patron through marriage. These relationships were survival mechanisms in a system where merit alone was never enough. Penkovsky's trajectory continued upward through the Frunze Military Academy, where he graduated in 1948 with a degree in military science. He joined the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, in 1953, the year of Stalin's death. By 1955, he was appointed military attaché in Ankara, Turkey, a position of significant trust. But here, Penkovsky made a critical error. He reported his superior officer for regulatory breaches, technically correct, politically catastrophic. The GRU does not reward those who expose the failures of others, even when those failures are genuine. Penkovsky was recalled, his career damaged. He attempted recovery through further education, studying rocket artillery at the Dzerzhinsky Military Academy for 9 months. The selection for military attaché to India seemed to promise redemption. But the KGB, the Soviet security service that viewed the GRU with institutional suspicion, had finally uncovered the full details of his father's history. The appointment was suspended. An investigation was launched. In November of 1960, Penkovsky was reassigned to the State Committee for Science and Technology, a bureaucratic exile. For a man of his ambition, his education, his record of service, This was professional death. Something inside Penkovsky broke, or perhaps, more accurately, something crystallized. He had given everything to a system that would never fully accept him, that would always view him through the lens of his father's choices. He had witnessed the brutality of Stalin's purges, the inefficiency and paranoia of Soviet leadership, the widening technological gap between the USSR and the West. He possessed intimate knowledge of Soviet military capabilities, and increasingly, he possessed access to the most sensitive secrets of the Soviet missile program through his work with the State Committee. To Western intelligence agencies, Oleg Penkovsky was priority red, not because he had committed any crime against the West, but because he represented something unprecedented, a senior Soviet military intelligence officer with access to strategic nuclear secrets and the apparent willingness to share them. The file that would eventually bear his name was about to be opened. In July of 1960, on the Bolshoi-Mosvoretsky Bridge in central Moscow, Oleg Penkovsky approached two American students. The encounter lasted seconds. He pressed a package into their hands and asked them to deliver it to an intelligence officer at the U.S. Embassy. Inside the package was an offer to commit treason, a detailed proposal to provide classified military intelligence to the United States. The students, uncertain and frightened, delivered the package as instructed. The CIA's response was caution, bordering on paralysis. Was this genuine? Or was it a KGB provocation designed to embarrass the United States or identify American intelligence assets in Moscow? The U.S. Embassy refused to cooperate, fearing an international incident. For months, Penkovsky's offer languished, unaccepted. But the CIA recognized that if this offer was genuine, it represented an intelligence opportunity of historic magnitude. They contacted their British counterparts at MI6, requesting assistance. The British brought a different approach, shaped by decades of managing human intelligence assets in hostile territory. They proposed using a civilian cutout, a businessman with legitimate reasons to travel to Moscow, someone who would attract less suspicion than diplomatic personnel. The man they selected was Greville Wynne, a salesman of industrial equipment who regularly conducted business behind the Iron Curtain. Wynne was approached, briefed, and recruited. The operation to contact Penkovsky was designated with two codenames, reflecting the joint nature of the effort. To the CIA, he would be Hero. To MI6, Yoga. The first meeting occurred in London in April of 1961, when Penkovsky traveled there as part of a Soviet trade delegation. Two American intelligence officers and two British counterparts met him in a secure location. What they heard astonished them. Penkovsky didn't want money. He wanted to damage the Soviet system he had come to despise. And he possessed information that contradicted fundamental Western assumptions about Soviet military power. For the next 18 months, Penkovsky provided what intelligence historians would later describe as a river of classified material. Thousands of pages of documents, photographs of secret installations, technical specifications of Soviet missiles. Most critically, he revealed that the Soviet nuclear arsenal was far smaller than Premier Nikita Khrushchev claimed, that Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile technology was years behind American capabilities, and that the USSR was not prepared for a nuclear confrontation with the West. This intelligence was invaluable, but it came with inherent risk. The CIA and MI6 established multiple communication protocols with Penkovsky. Dead drops at predetermined locations in Moscow, coded signals using chalk marks on telephone poles, brief, seemingly innocent telephone calls. Meetings with Janet Chisholm, the wife of an MI6 officer stationed in Moscow, who would encounter Penkovsky apparently by chance in parks or public spaces, receiving documents concealed in candy boxes or children's toys. The tradecraft was sophisticated, but every contact increased the probability of detection. Unknown to the Western handlers, Penkovsky's activities had already attracted attention, not immediately from the KGB, but from a more insidious threat: penetration of Western intelligence services. Jack Dunlap, a National Security Agency employee, was providing information to the KGB. The full extent of Soviet knowledge about Penkovsky remains debated, but evidence suggests they knew he was compromised far earlier than his eventual arrest. They chose to let him continue, protecting their sources inside Western agencies. building a legal case that wouldn't expose their penetrations. The KGB began constructing what they termed a discovery case, evidence accumulated through surveillance that would appear to result from Soviet counterintelligence work rather than insider information. They shadowed British diplomats. They monitored communication patterns. They waited for the optimal moment to act, balancing the intelligence Penkovsky was feeding to the West against the damage his arrest would inflict on Western operations. The hunters were patient, methodical, invisible. The summer and fall of 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than any moment before or since. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, convinced that President John F. Kennedy was weak following the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, authorized Operation Anadir, the secret deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba. The plan was audacious: install medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles just 90 miles from the American coast, present the United States with a fait accompli, and fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the Cold War. Soviet military planners believed they could complete the deployment before American intelligence detected it. They were mistaken. Penkovsky had provided detailed descriptions and technical specifications of Soviet missile systems, including the exact dimensions, launch site configurations, and deployment patterns. When American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft began photographing unusual construction activity in Cuba in October of 1962, CIA analysts recognized what they were seeing because Penkovsky had taught them what to look for. On the 14th of October, a U-2 flight captured definitive photographic evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction. President Kennedy was informed 2 days later. The crisis that followed brought the world to the precipice. But Kennedy possessed a critical advantage. Penkovsky's intelligence had revealed that the Soviet Union was not prepared for nuclear war, that their arsenal was smaller than claimed, that Khrushchev was, in strategic terms, bluffing. This knowledge gave Kennedy the confidence to impose a naval blockade rather than launch an immediate military strike, to pursue diplomacy while maintaining pressure. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the KGB made its move. On October the 22nd, 1962, the same day President Kennedy addressed the American people about the missiles in Cuba, Oleg Penkovsky was arrested. The timing was not coincidental. Soviet leadership, facing the Cuban crisis, could no longer afford the security risk of allowing a known traitor to remain at large, even if arresting him would compromise their intelligence sources. The arrest was clean, professional, practiced. Multiple vehicles, plainclothes officers. Penkovsky was taken to Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters, where interrogation would continue for months. But before his arrest, the KGB attempted one final operation. On November the 2nd, 1962, Penkovsky's Western handlers in Moscow received signals that appeared to be from him. 2 voiceless telephone calls and a chalk mark indicating a dead drop had been loaded. A CIA officer named Richard Jacob serviced the drop and was immediately arrested. The operation had been KGB theater, using Penkovsky's own communication protocols against his handlers. The interrogations were extensive. Alexander Zagvozdin, the chief KGB interrogator, would later state that Penkovsky was questioned perhaps 100 times. The objective was not merely confession, which Penkovsky provided, but comprehensive debriefing. What had he revealed? To whom? What Western intelligence officers had he met? What operational details could be extracted? The KGB was methodical, thorough, clinical. The trial, when it finally occurred, was a show. Soviet state television broadcast edited footage showing Penkovsky confessing, expressing remorse, denouncing the West. Greville Wynne, arrested in Budapest shortly after Penkovsky, was tried alongside him. The verdict was predetermined, guilty of treason and espionage under Articles 64 and 65 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. The sentence, death. The exact manner of Penkovsky's execution remains disputed. Official Soviet records claim he was shot and cremated, but persistent accounts suggest something more brutal. Soviet sculptor Ernst Neizvestny later claimed he was told by the director of the Donskoye Cemetery crematorium that Penkovsky was executed by fire, burned alive. Other sources describe him being bound to a stretcher and pushed into a crematorium furnace while still conscious. The truth may never be definitively established, but the variations themselves reveal something about the Soviet state's need for exemplary punishment. By the time the execution occurred, officially listed as May the 16th, 1963, the intelligence Penkovsky provided had already served its purpose. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been resolved. Soviet missiles were withdrawn from Cuba in exchange for American missiles being removed from Turkey, and a pledge not to invade Cuba. The world had stepped back from nuclear annihilation. Penkovsky's intelligence had been decisive in allowing that resolution. The Soviet public was not immediately informed of Penkovsky's arrest. For more than 7 weeks, the operation remained classified. When Pravda finally published the story in December of 1962, it named Greville Wynne and Richard Jacob as Penkovsky's contacts, but was carefully vague about the full scope of his betrayal. The Kremlin was caught between conflicting objectives: the need to prosecute treason publicly and the desire to minimize the revelation of how deeply Soviet security had been penetrated. The purge that followed Penkovsky's arrest was extensive but quiet. Sergei Vorontsov, Penkovsky's patron, who had risen to the rank of Chief Marshal of Artillery and Commander-in-Chief of Rocket Forces, was demoted to Major General in May of 1963. In June, he was expelled from the Central Committee for having relaxed his political vigilance. Soviet bureaucratic language for catastrophic judgment failure. 3 other officers were disciplined. Even Serov, head of the GRU, was removed from his position. The message was clear. The GRU had failed fundamentally in vetting and monitoring one of its own officers. Western intelligence agencies, meanwhile, recognized the operation for what it was, even without official confirmation. The patterns, the timing, the tradecraft all bore the signature of KGB counterintelligence at its most effective. There were no diplomatic protests of substance, no demands for explanations. Both sides understood the rules of this particular game. A spy had been caught, a spy had been executed, the invisible war continued. But within Western intelligence services, particularly in the CIA and MI6, a more troubling question emerged. How much had the Soviets known, and for how long? Evidence would later surface suggesting that Penkovsky's compromise had been detected within weeks of his recruitment in April of 1961. The theory, advanced by CIA counterintelligence officer Tenant Bagley, proposed that the KGB had allowed Penkovsky to continue operating for 16 months, carefully managing what information he could access, monitoring what he passed to the West, all while protecting their sources inside Western agencies. If this theory is correct, it transforms the entire narrative. Penkovsky was not a secret agent operating in the shadows, but a controlled asset, his every action observed, his intelligence potentially manipulated. Yet even if the KGB knew from the beginning, they could not control everything. The technical specifications Penkovsky provided, the photographic evidence, the detailed knowledge of Soviet missile capabilities, this information was verifiable through other means. It proved accurate. It influenced American policy. It may have prevented nuclear war. The debate over Penkovsky's authenticity has never been fully resolved. Peter Wright, the MI5 officer who would later write the controversial memoir Spycatcher, believed Penkovsky was a fake defection, a KGB plant from the beginning. He pointed to inconsistencies in the intelligence, the lack of exposed Soviet agents in the West, the seemingly too perfect nature of the operation. Others, including KGB defector Vladimir Sakharov, insisted Penkovsky was genuine, pointing to the severe reorganization of Soviet intelligence services following his arrest. Evidence that his betrayal had caused real damage. Mikhail Fradkov, head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, would later name Penkovsky as Russia's biggest intelligence failure when speaking with U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. This admission, decades after the Cold War's end, suggests the Russian intelligence community itself believes Penkovsky was a genuine defection, not a controlled operation. But ambiguity, strategic and operational, remains the natural state of intelligence work. Certainty is rare. Truth is negotiable. What matters is what decision-makers believed and how they acted on that belief. The consequences of the Penkovsky operation rippled outward in ways that transcended immediate intelligence value. Western services, having successfully run a deep penetration agent inside Soviet military intelligence, became more aggressive in their recruitment efforts. Soviet counterintelligence, having caught and executed that agent, became more paranoid, more willing to purge suspected security risks, more invested in penetrating Western agencies. The spiral of espionage and counter-espionage intensified. Trust, already scarce, became nearly extinct. Sergei Vorontsov, the man who had been Penkovsky's patron and protector, never recovered from the disgrace. His career ended in humiliation. His reputation permanently destroyed by his association with a traitor. He lived until 1983, 2 decades to contemplate how his mentorship had been exploited, how his trust had been weaponized against the state he served. The personal dimension of betrayal, the destruction of relationships and reputations, this too was part of the operation's cost. Greville Wynne, arrested alongside Penkovsky, was tried and sentenced to 8 years in a Soviet labor camp. He served 11 months before being exchanged for Soviet agent Conan Molody in April of 1964. He returned to Britain, wrote memoirs, gave interviews, lived with the knowledge that his role as courier had been part of an operation that may have saved millions of lives. He died in 1990. Having witnessed the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet system, his intelligence work had helped undermine. Today, the streets of Moscow where Penkovsky walked, where he made his dead drops, where he was arrested, these locations are unmarked. Commuters pass through them daily, unaware of the history that unfolded in these ordinary spaces. There are no plaques, no memorials, no acknowledgement that decisions made in these locations influenced the survival of human civilization. The invisibility was always the point. The Penkovsky file teaches us that history is made not only by presidents and generals, but by colonels and couriers, by intelligence officers and assets, by individuals who choose to betray or protect, to risk everything or preserve themselves. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, their actions rarely make headlines. But their decisions matter, often more than the public pronouncements of leaders, more than the visible events that dominate historical memory. In the end, Oleg Penkovsky was one man, motivated by resentment and conviction, possessing access and courage, who made the decision to commit treason in service of what he believed was a greater cause. The Soviet system executed him for this decision. Western intelligence services honored him for it, in classified ceremonies and secret commemorations. History judges him according to ideology and perspective, hero to some, traitor to others, both assessments simultaneously valid and incomplete. What remains is the file, the documents, the intelligence he provided, the operation that ran for 18 months, the arrest that ended it, the execution that closed it, and the questions, always the questions, about what was truly known, by whom, and when. These questions will never be fully answered. They exist in the permanent ambiguity of intelligence history, where certainty is illusion and every truth is partial. The invisible machinery of espionage continues. New assets are recruited, new operations are initiated, new files are opened to be studied by future historians who will face the same limitations, the same partial truths, the same classified redactions. The game continues because the stakes remain existential. Information is power, secrets are weapons. And somewhere, in Moscow or Washington or London or Beijing, another individual is making the decision that Penkovsky made, to betray or to protect, to risk everything or to preserve themselves, to become part of the invisible history that shapes the visible world. The Penkovsky file is closed, the man is dead. The operation is history. But the template endures, the lessons persist, the methods continue. This is the true legacy. Not any individual operation, but the demonstration that such operations are possible, that individuals can alter history, that the invisible war matters as much as the visible one, perhaps more, and so the streets of Moscow remain busy. The commuters pass, the buildings stand. History happened here, invisible and consequential, leaving no mark on the physical world, but altering everything nonetheless. This is the final truth of the Penkovsky operation, that the most important events often leave no visible trace, that history's turning points are frequently invisible, that the decisions that matter most are the decisions no one sees. This is the final lesson, that we live surrounded by invisible histories, by events that occurred but left no mark, by decisions that altered everything but remain unknown. The Penkovsky operation is just one example, briefly visible through declassification and historical study, before fading back into the shadows where such operations belong. But it happened. The consequences were real, and somewhere, another operation unfolds, another individual makes the fateful choice, another file begins, invisible and consequential, shaping the future in ways we will never fully understand.